It's been more than half a year since that day when another Putin protégé, Syrian President Bashar Assad, practically repeated the feat of the unforgettable Viktor Yanukovych. Having finally realized that no one was going to protect his precious self from the uprising people, Assad quickly fled to Moscow. And for good reason, as there was no place for him in the new Syria, except possibly in suspension. But what is the new Syria like? Who rules it today? What significant changes have taken place in the country over the past 6 months? Has the years-long civil war ended? What is the new political regime? And are Syrians living better under the new authorities? And what is the situation with the Russian bases there? Today we will analyze in detail the domestic political situation that has developed in Syria since December of last year. Of course, we will consider it as objectively as possible, avoiding cynical judgments. But most importantly, we will try to forecast the prospects for Syria's further development in the coming years. I'm Semyon, opening the How Did They Live section. Let's begin. How the Assad regime fell subtitles. Here, I won't go into detail about the civil war in Syria or the rule of Assad and his disgraceful escape. I'll only touch on these events briefly. First, let's figure out how one of the most enduring dictatorships in the Middle East fell. For 33 years, from 1971 to 2024, Syria was ruled by the Assad dynasty of dictators. First the father, Hafez, and then his son Bashar. But in 2011, the good times ended when much of the Syrian population rose up against poverty and lawlessness. This is how the years-long civil war in Syria began, which was accompanied by atrocities, repression, and even the use of nerve agents. Not only against the rebels, but also against the civilian population suspected of disloyalty. Initially, the ruling regime nearly lost, but Moscow then intervened. The Russian army helped to crush the Syrian rebel army, which allowed Assad to stay in power. The opposition remnants took refuge in the north, near the Turkish border. Only the protection of Turkish President Erdogan saved the rebels from complete destruction. And so, Assad regained control over most of Syria, stabilized and cemented the situation for several years. From 2017 to 2024, the front line hardly changed. With Russia as a powerful patron, it seemed the Syrian dictator would rule for a very long time. And then he would be buried with honors and mummified, just like Lenin or Mao Zedong. All the more paradoxical against this backdrop was Assad's fall in just 12 days. It may sound unoriginal, but the Syrian colossus turned out to have feet of clay. November 27, 2024. Unexpectedly, the messenger detachments launched a northern offensive against government troops and, to their own surprise, began winning victory after victory. The troops loyal to Assad quickly forgot about their loyalty and offered almost no resistance. Most of the soldiers simply scattered. Where did they go? There were few who wanted to die for the long-time dictator. Since the Russian army was heavily bogged down in the war with Ukraine, Putin could only help his ally with kind words and empty promises. Realizing his days were numbered, on December 8, Assad fled to Russia with some relatives and part of his entourage, and of course some of the wealth he had looted over many years of dictatorship. As a result, he is still living there to this day, keeping company with Yanukovych. The terrorist president. Yes, you heard right. The dictator president was replaced by a terrorist president, or more precisely, a former terrorist. His name is Ahmed Asharaa, but for most of his life he was known by his underground nickname Al-Julani. His political and military career is so unusual that you could easily make a Hollywood action movie about it, or better yet, an entire Netflix series. From a young age, he was an Islamic militant, and in the early 2000s, he joined the world's largest terrorist organization, Al-Qaeda. For several years, Asharaa operated in Iraq, but then he ended up in the infamous American prison Abu Ghraib, where he spent a long 5 years in captivity. After his release, he returned to Syria. The civil war that started there offered many chances for jihadists. There he became one of the field commanders, fighting against all of Assad's rebels, and later against the Islamic State as well. Ironically, Islamist Asharaa opposed the Islamic State and, after losing faith in al-Qaeda's ideals, cut ties with them too. In 2017, the future president formed Hayat Tahrir ash-Sham, and joined this Turkey-oriented rebel group, which survived with Turkish support. In fact, this choice determined his future fate. During the triumphant offensive on Damascus, it was Hayat Tahrir ash-Sham that acted as the main strike force and was the first among all the rebel groups to enter the capital. This fact shaped the composition and nature of the new Syrian authorities. After all, many in the West hoped that as a result of Assad's overthrow, those opposition forces would come to power in Syria that could be conditionally called liberal or, at the very least, moderate and pro-European. Ultimately, Islamists led the state, simply replacing one problem with another. How did the political system change? By the way, Asharaa positioned himself as an Islamist from the very first days of his rule, but as a rational, pragmatic and reasonable one, a person you could do business with, unlike the Ayatollah regime in Iran or the Taliban in Afghanistan. And so far, this policy is still bringing positive results. As for the political system itself, in January 2025, Asharaa, who initially did not hold any official positions, was declared the interim president of Syria for the transitional period without any elections. So yesterday's terrorist, bypassing even formal democratic procedures, received full power for an indefinite period. In March, Syria abolished the prime minister position. And now Asharaa is simultaneously both the head of state and the head of government, which in practice means an even greater consolidation of power in one person's hands. To be continued. The Syrian parliament, known as the People's Council, which played no real role during Assad's time anyway, was dissolved entirely by the new authorities. It's true that elections for a temporary legislative council were announced, but when they will take place and under what conditions is unknown. So at the moment, there is no body in Syria that even formally limits the power of the head of state, and it is clear that none will appear in the near future. The state's basic law has a similar situation. In the week after Assad's fall, the transitional government said a new democratic Syrian constitution would soon be adopted. But in the end, a kind of surrogate appeared called the Constitutional Declaration, adopted on March 13 of this year. This temporary constitution effectively establishes a presidential republic, and it minimizes the influence of the future parliament altogether. A significant role is also given to Islam as the main source of legislation, while all basic human rights and freedoms are declared, including gender equality for women. But their implementation in practice raises serious doubts. In short, it can already be stated that there is no sign of democracy in Syria. The country is clearly forming a personalist authoritarian regime, similar to Turkey or Egypt, which, in essence, will differ little from Assad's. As the saying goes, they ended up with exactly what they fought against: repressions and purges. As evidence of this point, one can mention how Asharaa deals with his political opponents, who were in power just yesterday. The Alawite uprising in March 2025 is especially telling in this context. The fact is that in Syria, in addition to Sunni Muslims, to which the new president belongs, there are many religious and national minorities, including the Alawites. They are representatives of a very distinctive branch of Islam, making up about 15% of Syria's population. But most importantly, the Assad family belonged to them, so during the rule of the former president, it was the Alawites who formed the main support of the ruling regime. But Assad fled, and in the eyes of the new authorities, the Alawites were considered accomplices of the criminal regime. Therefore, they faced repressions, which often took the form of spontaneous pogroms with violence against those who were unwanted, without trial or investigation, by some estimates. In just the first weeks of Asharaa's rule, several hundred Alawites were killed across the country, but that was just the beginning. Another wave of repression began in Latakia in early March 2025. Within a few days, the so-called security forces, made up mostly of former militants, arrested about 2,000 people, mainly from the Alawite, Shiite, and Christian minorities. These events were the last straw. On March 6, the Alawites rose up in Latakia province, and protests quickly turned into fierce armed clashes. At the same time, the new authorities in Syria immediately began suppressing the new uprising, using both military resources and killing civilians suspected of supporting the local Alawites. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, between March 6 and March 8, 2025, the Syrian authorities killed at least 979 civilians. Therefore, these actions are classified by the international community as ethnic cleansing. However, Asharaa was not stopped by this. He continued the repression until almost all centers of the uprising were completely suppressed. International recognition of the new government. Surprisingly, this area has seen success, with the international community largely recognizing Syria's new government. Former terrorist ties and no nationwide mandate didn't stop this, as none of the current leaders were elected by the Syrian people. Asharaa and his entourage came to power not because of the rule of law, but solely because of the law of the strong. But in any case, it turns out that even former terrorists are dealt with, especially if it promises certain benefits. Such are the realities of politics. During his short time in power, Asharaa has already made official visits to Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and everywhere he is received as an equal. And the number of delegations he has received has already reached several dozen, including, in particular, the Ukrainian one. Most importantly, Donald Trump finally and fully legitimized the new Syrian president in the eyes of the world. On May 14, 2025, during his tour of the Persian Gulf countries, the American president met with many leaders of Muslim states, including Syria. However, despite the international recognition of the new authorities, for example, Asharaa is still listed in Interpol's databases as a wanted terrorist. The United States and Israel are still offering $10 million for his head. Perhaps the blame lies with the ever-late, sluggish bureaucratic machine. Or maybe the Americans and Israelis are signaling to the Syrian president that they know his true nature and their stance toward him remains unchanged. Who knows? That's just how international politics is. What happened to the Russian bases in Syria? As I already said, the stability of Assad's regime was primarily ensured by the Russian military presence. It had two main bases, Tartus and Khamim. The first one is a naval base and was established back in 1971 in accordance with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' desire to have its own military fleet in the Mediterranean Sea. This helped counter United States influence in the region. Let me specifically remind you that nearby Greece and Turkey are members of NATO, and since Moscow was already acting as Syria's main ally at that time, having its own base in Tartus was extremely important for it. As for the base in Khamim, it is also an air base and was established in 2015. As a token of gratitude from Assad to Putin for the brotherly assistance provided in destroying his own compatriots, the rebels. For Russia, this airbase is important because it is essentially the main logistics hub that connects the North Caucasus with African countries. This allowed the Russian authorities to quickly deploy mercenary units to countries in North and Central Africa. For example, the well-known Wagner fighters actively operated in Sudan, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Mozambique, and of course in Libya, and all of them passed through the Khamim base. However, overthrowing the Assad regime allowed Syria's new leaders to remove the Russian military presence. This benefited both Ukraine and the leading Western countries. Fortunately, Asharaa and others like him did not have much sympathy for Moscow, since the carpet bombings of Aleppo, Palmyra, Homs, Idlib, and about a dozen other cities by Russian aviation in 2016 were still fresh in their memory. However, after more than half a year, the Tartus and Khamim bases still remained in place, although the number of military personnel there was reduced by almost half. Also, according to satellite data, at the beginning of the year, some equipment and machinery were removed from them. Most likely, Moscow is trying to negotiate with the new authorities in Syria to keep these bases. This topic was the focus of the Russian delegation's visit on January 28, 2025. But at the same time, the Kremlin is preparing for the possibility of a forced evacuation. A final decision on the SRA hasn't been made yet, but Russian influence in the Middle East has already weakened. War or peace? And finally, let's answer a question that might interest many people. Has the civil war, which had been going on since 2011, ended? Did Bashar al-Assad's consolidation of power bring the long-awaited peace to Syria? Are Syrians living in greater safety now? I'll say up front, there's no clear answer to these questions. On one hand, the intensity of fighting has significantly decreased over the past 6 months, which is already quite important. But achieving even a state that could be described as a fragile peace is still a long way off. Alas, the fall of Assad's dictatorship did not automatically bring peace, calm, and stability. And although Ashara's government is recognized by the whole world as the only legitimate authority in Syria, in reality, he, like his predecessor Bashar Assad, controls little more than half of the country's total territory. The new authorities control the largest cities, such as Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and the surrounding areas. But, for example, in the northeast of Syria, since 2012 there has been a self-proclaimed quasi-state called Syrian Kurdistan, with its center in the city of Rojava, and it occupies more than a quarter of the country's territory. In the south of Syria, the real power belongs to the Druze, an ethno-confessional group of Arabs who openly sympathize with Israel and do not obey the central authorities, neither during Assad's time nor today. Also, along the borders with Jordan, many groups of former rebels have settled, who refuse to submit to the new authorities and now engage in looting and drug trafficking. Not far from Iraq, remnants of the Islamic State are still roaming around, and they are basically at war with everyone. In addition, there are many soldiers across the country who deserted from Assad's army but don't like the new authorities either. Take the Alawites, for example. Most of Syria faces instability from violence and weak law and order. At the same time, the Syrian people sincerely express joy over Assad's fall, but are very concerned about their future. And their future is uncertain. So what has changed? In conclusion, after Assad's overthrow, we reach some disappointing conclusions. Unfortunately, there have been no significant improvements in Syria. There are no positive changes in the socio-economic processes, nor are any expected, and the vast majority of Syrians continue to live in poverty, just as they did before. After all, the normal functioning of the economy is impossible without achieving peace and internal stability, and we also can't expect security and respect for human rights. The brutal suppression of the Alawite uprising is a clear example. If we talk about the political sphere, it's clear that the formation of a new dictatorship under Asharaa is looming on the horizon. It seems that one tyrant has simply been replaced by another. The only fundamental change has been a drastic shift in Syria's foreign policy. While Assad was effectively under the protectorate of Russia and Shia Iran, the new authorities are orienting their foreign policy towards Sunni states, primarily Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. This fact, by the way, played a significant role in the recent 12-day war between Israel and Iran. If Assad had remained in power, it's possible that Syria would have attacked Israel from the northeast, at least to divert Israeli forces or to try to reclaim the long-lost Golan Heights. And now Syria is staying out of this conflict, and that's the right thing to do. They have more than enough internal problems of their own. The state's future development will depend directly on domestic politics. If stabilization is achieved, even if the conflict is just frozen for a long time, then Syria has a chance to become, if not a developed and democratic state, at least a place that is quite acceptable for ordinary people to live and develop. How do people live in nearby Iraq, Pakistan, or Egypt? Migration from Syria to Europe will continue, only the scale and intensity are uncertain. The worst-case scenario could be a new round of civil war. Disagreements between the Ashar government, Kurds, Druze, Islamist groups, and the remnants of Assad loyalists could at any moment lead to large-scale armed clashes. In that case, amid the chaos, the resurgence of the Islamic State or other major extremist groups is quite possible. And external players such as Turkey or Israel will inevitably increase their interference in Syria's internal affairs, which could easily lead to the fragmentation of the state into Sunni, Kurdish, Alawite, and Druze zones. Syria will ultimately and permanently lose its unity, as Somalia once did. It will be possible to understand which scenario events in Syria will follow in the next 2 to 3 years, maybe even sooner. In any case, we are closely monitoring these processes and sincerely wish the Syrian people success on their path to achieving peace and prosperity. Ordinary Syrians definitely deserve this. That's all from me. Goodbye, everyone.